Hello everyone and happy spooky month. Steven here with Rabid Hobbies. Now I love the Skaven. When I think about Warhammer the Old World or Age of Sigmar, it's the rat men that really stand out to me as the most uniquely Warhammer faction. The elves and dwarves and orcs are all well and good, but Tolkien had them. Dungeons and Dragons have them. The Skaven are uniquely Warhammer, and their cutthroat, vicious, everyone out for themselves mentality is something that really reflects the bleakness of the setting. If you're a Skaven player, you know that you need lots of rats. You're probably not just painting 20 clan rats. You might be painting 40, or 80, or 120. But that takes time. And if you're like me, you want to spend your time painting all the strange and wonderful Skaven toys, like the Doom Flayers and the Rat Ogres, Vermin Lords, Screaming Bells, but you still want your clan rats to look good, just not at the expense of your sanity. So look no further. You've heard of Slap Chop? I give you Rat Chop.
Rat Chop.
Paint them fast, yes.
This is a lightning fast way of painting Skaven that look good on the tabletop too. This can be done with a brush or an airbrush. In this video, I'm going to use a brush only. In my next video, I'm going to show you how to do it with an airbrush to get even faster. And finally, I'll be painting the entire Skaventide set as fast as possible. Alright, let's get into it. So my first step is to get out my wet palette. And we'll be base coating with a darker flesh tone. For this one I chose Shadow Flesh by Pro Acryl, but you can use whatever dark flesh tone that you have in your kit. For my lighter flesh tone, or my mid-tone, I used Tan Flesh, and for my lightest highlight I used Pale Pink. Here we can see the Skaven clan rat that I selected to paint, already primed up and ready to go. You can use brush-on primer or a rattle can, or airbrush primer if you have it. Grabbing my little sponge for some moisture. We are going to be dry brushing here, but dry brushing is kind of a misnomer because you don't want it to be totally dry. Just a couple of drops of water on the sponge is all I need for enough moisture here. And for this first step, I'm going to be using an Army Painter dry brush, but you can use whatever one you have. I also like to use soft makeup brushes that you can get at the dollar store. For this first step, I will be using my wet palette, and that's because this is just a base coat. I'll be using a couple drops of Shadow Flesh, and I'll just be stippling this all over the model. We just want to get a base coat of this darker flesh everywhere. Don't worry about perfect opacity, but you do want to make sure that you cover up all the black at least. Just stippling and jabbing all over the model until every bit is covered. Looking pretty good, but there's some small spots that my brush wouldn't reach, so I'm going to go in with a smaller brush. And just make sure to cover up any of those black bits. Alright, first coat is looking pretty good. Time to move on to actually dry brushing. This time I'll be using a regular dry palette to make sure I control any excess moisture. We're going to be dry brushing on our mid-tone of Tan Flesh. When I dry brush, I personally like to use my texture palette to make sure that it's coming off the brush the way that I want it. I also use a tiny bit of paper towel to just rub any excess off my brush. Now we're gently brushing in a downward motion and along the grain of any texture on the model. You're looking to cover probably 80% to 85% of the surface that you had previously painted, just highlighting the raised areas. Alright, this is how it should look at this stage. The next step is a light dry brush highlight of Pale Pink. Putting a drop of pink on our dry palette and adding a tiny bit of moisture to our brush, I'm switching to a lighter, softer makeup brush. Loading up the paint into my bristles and then rubbing off any excess on my paper towel and then testing it on my texture palette before I add anything to the model itself. Then I'm coming in with a downward motion again and running across any textures, this time depositing less paint on just the highest highlights. This is going to serve as our pre-shading for our next steps. So this is very similar to Slap Chop, but instead of using just a neutral color, we're using our flesh tones for our underpainting. Before you move on, this is what your model should look like. For the next step, we're breaking out the Fidget Popper palette because we'll be using Army Painter Speedpaint from here on. For the wood and the fur bits, we'll be using Fire Drake and Ruddy Fur. You don't have to use Army Painter Speedpaints for this, you can use contrast paints as well. And for variation within my Clan Rat unit, I actually use many different shades of brown, including close to black. But I avoided using whites or grays because that's really for gray seers, and I avoided using black because that tends to be storm vermin. So I just put a couple drops of Fire Drake into my Fidget palette. And I'm using this color for all of the wood bits. Just painting in the face, the rim, and the back of that shield. Take care not to overload your brush. Speed paint tends to run into the crevices, and you don't want to make a mess all over your miniature. I don't really mind if the speed paint gets on anything I'm going to be painting in silver, but I don't want too much of it to run into the parts that are going to be the cloak. Alright, the wood's looking good. Moving on. Putting down a couple drops of Ruddy Fur. You're going to paint in the fur around his head and neck. You're going to be also painting the arms and legs out towards the paws. Some of these models have patches where their cloak doesn't cover their back or their chest, and so I paint those areas as well. Next, for all the fleshy bits, I'll be using some Crusader skin. This color is very subtle, and you're going to slap this all over on all the fleshy bits. It's going to warm up those pieces a bit, and I don't even worry if I get this on any other surfaces. It's so mild that it doesn't mess up the robes or the metal or any other bits. You can just slap this on. The robe color and the metal colors are intense enough that it covers it without any issue. This whole step took me only about 45 seconds to 1 minute, so I really didn't have to speed this up at all. But I did anyways for shortening up the video. This guy painted up super fast, but if you want to go even faster, do an assembly line. Do blocks of 10 at a time, or if you're crazy like me, you can do blocks of 30. And the underpainting with this kind of fleshy sepia looking tone is going to warm up all the other tones. And this is fine, I think, for Skaven. Skaven tend to a warmer side of the color palette. You have Clan Molder and Clan Pestilence. Even the green of Clan Pestilence is kind of a warmer green. So for the robes of my clan rats, I decided to use Poppy Red.
I love it.
This is a beautiful, bright, vibrant red. And for the metallics, I'll be using Broadsword Silver. Using the Broadsword Silver, I'll be painting his weapon, also the rim of his shield, and the chainmail of his armor. Again, with all speed paint, be careful not to overload your brush. The stuff does flow quite freely. Then we're going to paint the chainmail that lies underneath their cloaks. And lastly, we're going to paint the rim of the shield. This is the part that you have to be very careful with. If you notice, I use the back of my thumb just to test the consistency of the paint and making sure it doesn't run off too freely. Take care to make sure that the edge of the shield is painted. Here's how we should be looking up to now. Now we're starting on our cloak. I'm taking care that I avoid his rope belt, and I'm not allowing any of the red to flow to where I don't want it. It's better to be cautious and not overload your brush at this point. At this point, it's kind of like a coloring book. You're just coloring in the lines and blocking in the color. If you feel like you want a little bit more coverage, feel free to go over with one more coat. Here I did a little bit of that just to punch up the red. You do want to make sure the previous layer is 100% dry at this point though, before you move on to the second layer. My second layer was not full coverage, it was just in the spots where I wanted a bit more brightness. Here we are after the red coat on the robes. And now for the secondary robe color, we'll be using Grim Black. Now you'll notice he has a bird's skull on his head, and to paint that beak we're going to be using Sand Golem, and we'll also use that for the rope belt. I also decided to use this for the wrapping on his weapon, and a bit of yellowing on his claws, and the beak. Now the speed paints are done, we're going to work on the base, painting the little tactical rock that he's standing on. There's also another bird skull on the base that we'll tackle too. I chose to use neutral gray by Pro Acryl, but any neutral gray that you have in your collection will work just fine for this. Mix up our paint here with a little bit of water, and roll our brush to make our tip. Now we just paint our tactical rock gray. We're taking care around the toes of our little rat man here, but we're not worrying about the skull or the base because those will be painted over the next step. Now we're picking out a nice bone color. I chose to use Ivory by Pro Acryl. And now we just base coat the skull. 1 or 2 quick coats is all we need for coverage. Doesn't need to be perfect. And once we have a nice base coat for this, we're going to use the same color for his teeth and nails. As with painting any really fine details, take care not to overload your brush. You don't want it running off. I like to test my paint on the back of my thumb as I'm painting just to make sure. Be careful if you can, but if you make mistakes, it will get cleaned up a bit in the next steps. This model does have some leather straps, and for that I'm going to be using light umber, but you can use whatever leather color you have in your toolbox. Remember to always thin your paints and always roll your points. Quick test here for paint consistency to make sure it's coming off the tip like I want it. Now you can choose to base your miniature however you like. I was inspired by this tidal area where the mud flats tended to dry out and crack. So for this I'll be using the technical paint Agrellan Earth. A lot of people use this paint to represent deserts, but actually the area where I was inspired was a wetlands that I walk by almost every day. Now the way that this paint works is the thicker you slap it on, the larger the cracks. So if you want really small cracks, go thin, and if you want a big, thick crackling effect, you want to really lay it on thick. So for me, I'm going to slap it all over the base. Now, if you're not using a paint like this and you're just going to be using sand, you would have wanted to put this on the base before the painting step. Then you could paint it and dry brush it if that was your preference. Alright, for the next step we're going to want to seal in our work, and for that we'll be using high gloss varnish. I choose to use Liquitex, but any high gloss varnish will do. Now usually I choose to airbrush my varnishes, but I committed to doing this entirely with a brush, so that's what I'm going to do. One thing to keep in mind when brushing on a varnish like this is you want to make sure that you don't get any air bubbles in there. There is a chance those bubbles actually can harden, and then you end up with a bubble on your model, which is not ideal. Unless you're going super Nurgle, then that might be the look you're going for. Now when varnishing a crackle base like this, you should take care you don't want to chip off any of the crackle finish, but ultimately this will protect the finish. Don't worry if it looks slightly milky at this stage, it will all dry clear, and it will protect all the painting that you've done up to this point. Now this next step is an amazing secret weapon for speed painting. We're going to be doing an oil wash with Winsor & Newton oil colors. The colors that I like to use for this are Ivory Black and Burnt Umber. I like to use Winsor & Newton, but any decent oil color should work just fine. And I like to mix these in these little condiment cups that I get off of Amazon, or you can find them at the dollar store. Now to create our wash, we'll be using mineral spirits to dilute. You cannot dilute oil colors with water. You have to use mineral spirits or another similar thinner. Now here's how he looks before our oil wash. Now you might be happy with this. I mean, he is a little shiny, but trust me, trust the process. It'll look great when it's done. Now to mix up my oil wash, I'll be using a pea-sized bit of oil paint from each tube. And just smear that bit on the bottom of the condiment cup. This will make for a nice dingy wash that's somewhere between Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. I find it to be a great mix to slop all over Skaven. Now we're just adding some drops of mineral spirits to the cup. And I don't use a hard or fast ratio to this. In this case, I think I'm using about a 2-to-1 ratio. But I mix in the cup and I take a look and see how it's pooling and pouring down the sides of the cup to decide if I want to add more mineral spirits. I use this cheap brush to kind of smush up all the paint and make sure it's well mixed. And I add a little bit more mineral spirits if I feel like it needs to be thinner. As an army painter, I can tell you, do not be afraid of oil washes. It's not that difficult. The oil paints last forever. I've had these same 2 tubes for ages. All right, now we just kind of slop it on the model. Now, if you're painting for quality, you want to be really careful about where it runs, but here we're going for speed, so I'm just slapping it on everywhere. The wonderful thing about oil washes is you can remove what you don't want after the fact. So we put it on, we let it dry, and then we're going to use our makeup sponges or Q-tips and some more mineral spirits to pull off from the areas we don't want. It's like a Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade, except you can control where everything goes and it doesn't dry so quickly. Once it is dry, you can take it off. It's wonderful. So once the oil wash is going everywhere that I want it, I just have to set it aside and let it dry. I usually give it about an hour, sometimes up to 2 hours, before I go back in and remove. Alright, so here's how he looks after he's had a chance to dry. He's looking pretty good overall, but he does have some areas that I'll want to correct with a makeup sponge. And I'll want to bring out some highlights. I can see there's a bit too much pooling here around his backwards knee, whatever you call this on a rat. So let's get this cleaned up. Just going to break out the trusty makeup sponges. I used to use Q-tips for this. I didn't like the fact that sometimes it would leave behind little hairs. You can find this and other supplies in the link in the video description. I'm going to gently rub the makeup sponge all along the model, focusing on the upper ridges, anywhere the light would hit. I'm kind of coming in and doing a form of highlighting in reverse here. I'm just brushing away all the excess dark shade you can see under the rim as it brushes away. And this makeup sponge is totally dry. I haven't added any mineral spirits to this. This is just rubbing off the surface layers. I do this all over the model, paying particular attention to where the highlights would be, the edges of the face, the top of the ears, top of the nose. And if you look at the face, you can see that there's layers of highlights that are appearing out of nowhere. Up to this point, we only added our Crusader flesh after our dry brush layer, but somehow it looks like we've spent all this time layering. Pay attention to the knuckles on the feet, Look at the tail. There's all kinds of areas where it looks like we put a lot more effort in than we actually have. And that's what makes this method work so well for speed painting, but still having high quality. So here he is after just the cleanup with the dry makeup brush, looking pretty good. We could stop here, but I'm gonna go in with the makeup brush with a little bit of mineral spirits to get even more highlights out. All right, going back to the mineral spirits, and this time I'm adding just a single drop to the clean end of my makeup sponge. And I'm going to go back to the highest highlights and to the areas on the red cloak and the tail where I want to bring the color back. You can see how much the cloak brightens back up again as we're pulling away from the upper edges. And pay attention to how the tail and face and hands look. This really is magic. So our rat boy is looking pretty good, but he is really glossy still, so we're going to have to tone that down. So we're going back to our varnish, but this time with a matte varnish, and one thing, you really have to shake the ever-living crap out of your matte varnish.
One eternity later.
I find that when you brush the varnish on, this is even more true. When I airbrush, sometimes I can get away with a lazy shake, but when brushing it on, you really have to shake the hell out of it. So as I said, I am committed to using a brush. I'm going to go in and brush on this matte varnish and take the shine back down. I'm going to be focusing on the skin and the robes, the wood, anything essentially that's not the metal, to get rid of that shine off the model. But I want to keep the metals nice and shiny. This is actually one of the areas where using a brush is an advantage over an airbrush. Oftentimes, if I use matte varnish on a model that has a lot of metal bits, I go back in with a gloss varnish with a brush to brighten those back up again and restore that shine. Alright, waited for him to dry. The matte varnish has done its job and he's looking pretty great. So I want to clean up some of that Grelin earth that kind of spilled over the base and just make a consistent, nice matte black rim around the base. So I'm going to come in here with some coal black by Pro Acryl. Now to make it look like the area I see on my walks, I'm going to need to add some vegetation. I'm throwing on some Highland tufts from the Army Painter. Alright, and with this step, our rat is done. Here's how he looks with just the basics of Rat Chop, and he was painted super fast. I think almost anybody would be pretty happy with this level of detail for a tabletop mini, but we can take it further still. Let me show you the few things I would add to bump the level of detail up even further. You could go ahead and call this Rat Chop Plus.
Rat Chop. Plus. Sharp eyes and sharper weapons.
Adding some visual impact to this mini, I'm going to be focusing on the metals, the claws, the eyes, and the skin. I'll be using bold pyro red, and orange, and golden yellow. This is actually the same way that I paint the eyes for my Tyranids. First I go in with red, and I paint the entirety of both eyeballs. Gotta be careful not to overload your brush. This does not take much paint. Then I grab some orange, test the consistency on the back of my thumb, and I carefully paint the eyeball, making sure to leave the edges still red. To be clear, we're no longer speed painting here, we're just using the time we saved from speed painting. We can focus on these little details which really add to the model. So now I grabbed my yellow, and now I'm adding just a touch of yellow to the very center of the eye. This gives you a menacing, almost glowing looking eye. Now I'm going to bright ivory to add some highlights to the bone, claws, and teeth. This effect is subtle, but I feel like it really makes a difference. We'll add a little bit of highlight to his bird hat and his claws. Moving on for some highlights on the skin, we're going to be using tan flesh and pale pink. We'll start with just the flesh and we'll add the pink in as we highlight. Apologies for the blur here, my camera was overheating a little bit.
Why isn't this working?
Alright, that's a little better.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
Well, here's the face after those highlights. Mixed in some of the pink. We'll do the ridges on the tail as well. And any other of the brightest highlights on the skin. Also hit the tip of his nose and his eyebrows and ear. High cheekbones. Here's how he looks after those highlights. Moving on to the metals, we're going to use one of my favorite colors, Vallejo Metal Color Silver, which is a metallic that works wonderfully through an airbrush, but also great through a brush. You just got to be careful because it is very thin and you do have to shake it really well. But it gives a beautiful lustrous metallic finish. You can see how thin it is here. You have to be very careful to test the consistency before you put it on your model. Gently with the side of my brush, I'm going to go around and edge highlight all of the weapon. This really adds a real sheen to all of the metal and just makes the weapon look sharp. Grabbing a tiny bit more paint. Being really careful here, we're going to go in and we're going to add an edge highlight just to the outer edge of that shield. Adding a little to the inside edge as well. And tiny little highlights on the rivets. Lastly, we're going to go in and hit all the chainmail, just the very, very edge of it. This really helps catch the eye with the metallic sheen, and it really helps sell it as being metal. Alright, here we have our final finished model after Rat Shop and Rat Shop Plus. All of the really tedious parts of the painting were just blasted out really quick, and I could focus on adding these extra details at the end. This one was done, like I said, 100% with a brush, but I also finished the rest of his unit using an airbrush. Now in my next video, I'm going to show you how to do it with an airbrush for even faster results. And coming up right now is going to be a montage of him and all the other clan rats in his unit. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you found this video helpful, remember to do all the YouTube things, like, comment, and subscribe. Help me build the channel. Let me know what you want to see next. Would you like to see more Skaven? Yes. Stay tuned to see me paint the entire Skaventide set in one go.